On the 14th of April 1471, the Battle of Barnet took place. It was the beginning of the culmination of a startling series of events in the Wars of the Roses, the battle for the throne between the houses of York and Lancaster at the end of the 15th century. So what led to this mammoth battle? Who was involved? Why were they fighting? And how did it all play out and help to define the future of England? Let's take a look at the Battle of Barnet. One of the armies fighting at the Battle of Barnet was essentially a Yorkist army led by King Edward IV, the first Yorkist king. Edward had taken the throne in 1461 after the Battle of Towton, but he'd lost it 10 years later, effectively for failing to deliver on the reform agenda that had swept him to power. He'd been ejected from the kingdom in 1470, replaced with King Henry VI, the very man that Edward himself had deposed, having fallen out with his cousin Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Edward, by this point, is 28. He's 6'4", he's the tallest man ever to have sat on the throne of England, and he had a fierce reputation in battle. But nevertheless, he'd let himself go maybe a little bit. He'd definitely lost his crown. And I quite often think of his time in exile in Burgundy as perhaps being something like a Rocky training montage video of him getting himself back into shape, determined to take back his throne. At the Battle of Barnet, Edward is supported by his two remaining brothers, George, who is 20, and who had been involved in the rebellion that had seen Edward driven from the kingdom, but who had been reconciled once Edward had returned. He's also supported by his youngest brother, Richard, who is 18, and at this point Duke of Gloucester. He goes on, of course, to become the infamous Richard III, but at this point he is just the Duke of Gloucester, about to get his very first taste of battle. There's one great quote by a Milanese ambassador in France who was writing back home about Edward being ejected from his kingdom and then trying to win it back. And he wrote that it's a difficult matter to go out by the door and then to try and enter by the window. Some people think he will leave his skin there. Clearly there wasn't much hope that Edward would win his throne back, but nevertheless he was back on English soil and he was determined to win back his crown. The Lancastrian army that opposed Edward really had very little that was Lancastrian about it. It was led by Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man who famously becomes known later on as the Kingmaker. Having placed Edward on the throne, he had now removed him, put Henry VI back on the throne instead. Warwick had fallen out with his cousin Edward throughout the 1460s, their relationship souring to the point that Warwick had rebelled against Edward, championed a return to Henry VI, and driven his cousin out of the kingdom. Alongside Warwick was his younger brother Montague. Montague was John Neville, and by this time he was 40 years old. He had risen in the service of Edward IV, shown nothing but loyalty to the king, became Earl of Northumberland as a result of it, only to lose it all as his brother Richard Neville fell from favour. John probably felt quite unfairly treated, and by this point he had joined with his older brother, the Earl of Warwick, to fight against Edward. The other leader on the battlefield was John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, a man who goes on to become an incredibly famous soldier. He was perhaps the most militarily experienced and qualified man in the kingdom at this point. Oxford is 28, the same age as Edward. And Edward, after he'd become king, had executed Oxford's father and his older brother. And so there were very personal reasons for Oxford to be on the battlefield opposed to Edward. The final senior nobleman arrayed against Edward at the Battle of Barnet was the Duke of Exeter. Holland is an enigmatic figure. He had been married to Edward, George and Richard's older sister Anne, but they'd been separated in the mid-1460s. Exeter had never really been reconciled to Yorkist kingship and had been a thorn in the side of the regime. He took this chance to get back on the Lancastrian side and to fight against his former brother-in-law. So really, between Warwick Montague, Oxford and Exeter, we're looking at a very personal alliance against Edward IV at this point. These were people who had personal reasons to dislike Edward, dislike his rule, and to fight against it in favour of Henry VI. Why were the two armies fighting at this point? Aside from the obvious that there were two competitors now for the crown of England. Edward had arrived back in England after his exile in Burgundy. He'd landed in the north a few weeks earlier and had marched south trying to gather men, but not really having as much success as he might have hoped for, until he reached the Midlands and people began to flock to his cause. He had cornered Warwick in Coventry and tried to coax the Earl out for a battle, but Warwick had refused to be drawn out and wouldn't fight his cousin. Edward had then moved on to London. He'd freed his wife and family from sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. He'd met his firstborn son for the first time. Prince Edward had been born while his father was in exile. And so he had control of the capital city again. The other part of the Lancastrian alliance against Edward was Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou, and their son, Prince Edward, who was now 17 years old and beginning to take on the role of a man. They'd been in France, but were due to set sail for England at any time. Edward may well have felt that he could try and deal with half of the Lancastrian force while they were still separated and split, rather than allow them the time to form a coalition against him that might prove undefeatable. And so quickly, Edward raised all the men that he could. The chronicles give him about 7,000 men leaving London. They give Warwick about 10,000, although accounts of numbers in battles are notoriously hard to pin down and be certain of. But Edward gathered what he could and he left London, marching north to confront the Earl of Warwick. For Warwick's part, he thought his brother George Neville, the Archbishop of York, was in control in London. He sent letters to George telling him to hold the city against Edward IV, to keep the gates shut. And so Warwick marched south, thinking that he would pin Edward's army against the walls of London and press them in a vice. And so they met at Barnet. They arrived the night before and both armies set up camp. It was already dark. No one was quite sure where the enemy was. Warwick ordered his cannon to open fire and the shot flew overhead. They'd camped a lot closer than either side had realised. And so Edward ordered his men to keep quiet and make no sound all night. They just allowed the gunshot to fly overhead and Warwick to have no idea where they were. As they went to bed, perhaps for a difficult night's sleep, they knew that battle awaited in the morning. When the two armies awoke the next morning, they found the morning shrouded in mist and fog. They could barely see their hands in front of their faces. The armies were nevertheless laid out for battle. Edward gave control of his vanguard on the right hand side, traditionally the side that would engage first, to his youngest brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In his first taste of battle, it was an incredible honour for Richard. Edward held the centre with George. Perhaps George was not yet trustworthy enough to be given a control of his own. And on the left flank, the traditional rear guard, was William Lord Hastings, who was effectively Edward's best mate. They'd been together through thick and thin. He'd shared exile with Edward too, and his future prosperity relied on Edward winning his crown back. On the Lancastrian side, the vanguard was given to the Earl of Oxford, the most experienced commander that was available. He was on the right flank of Warwick's army. Warwick and his brother Montague would hold the centre themselves. And on the left flank, the rear guard, was the Duke of Exeter, the erstwhile brother-in-law of the brothers of York. At about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, Edward ordered his cannons to open fire. Warwick was fully prepared and immediately returned the barrage. But the battle very quickly came to hand-to-hand combat, and this is where the fog would play a critical part. The two armies, without realising it, had lined up off-centre. Edward's right overlapped Warwick's left, and vice versa on the other side. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, found himself able to outflank the Duke of Exeter. He found them going fairly easy on that right flank. In the centre, the fighting was fierce and evenly matched. The problem for Edward's army, and the bonus for Warwick's, was on the other flank, where Oxford was able to overlap Hastings' forces and pin them down. In short order, Hastings' force panicked and fled. Oxford's army pursued them all the way back to the town of Barnet and fell to plundering, assuming that the battle was won and the job was done. The real problem arose when Oxford's army tried to make it back to the battlefield. They arrived on the flank of Warwick's force, showing the Earl of Oxford's badge of the Star and Streamers, but in the fog and the uncertainty of war, it was mistaken for Edward IV's own badge of a sun in splendour. Warwick's forces opened fire on the Earl of Oxford. Oxford's force cried treason. Warwick's force panicked. There was perhaps some latent concern that Warwick or Montague or both of them couldn't be trusted and might have turned back to Edward's side. But Oxford's force fled in panic. Warwick's force fell apart and ran into the woods behind them. Warwick and Montague were both killed in the retreat. There were stories that Edward had given the order that Warwick was to be spared and taken alive, but that his men took matters into their own hand, perhaps concerned that their master might be too free with his pardon to Warwick and prolong the problems further, and that he was chased down and killed. Back in London, the bodies of Warwick and his brother Montague were put on display at St Paul's Cathedral so that all could be certain that they were gone. It was a macabre but necessary tradition. The writer of The Arrival, an anonymous member of Edward IV's campaign party, wrote that it was done because doubtless else the rumour should have been sown about in all countries that they both, or else at least the Earl of Warwick, were yet alive. Edward had achieved what he'd wanted to do at Barnet. His cousin Warwick, his cousin Montague were dead. Exeter was assumed dead on the battlefield, only to be later discovered alive and taken away to lick his wounds. The Earl of Oxford escaped and would go on to play a critical role in the endings of the Wars of the Roses. One incident worthy of mention is that Gerhard von Wessel, a foreign merchant, wrote a newsletter back to the continent following the Battle of Barnet, and he said that the Duke of Gloucester and the Lord Scales were severely wounded, but they had no lasting harm from it, God be praised. Lord Scales was Anthony Rivers, the brother-in-law of Edward IV. And obviously Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had picked up a serious injury in his first taste of battle, though there's no hint of what that injury might have been. I've wondered whether it could have been damage to his finger. If we look at one of the portraits of him from his time as king, it's possible that he maybe have been missing the end of one of his fingers. Certainly those bones were missing from his skeleton when it was recovered, though it's hard to know whether that was a result of an injury in battle or the loss of those small bones over the ensuing centuries. Nevertheless, Richard would soon be ready to go out and fight for his brother again. For Edward, half the job was done. He was back in control of England. He was back on the throne. London was his city again. His brother George was back in the fold, having initially rebelled and joined Warwick. His younger brother Richard had been blooded in battle and was now ready to fully serve his brother's regime. Warwick was dead along with Montague. But this still left Margaret of Anjou and her 17-year-old son, Edward, Prince of Wales, who needed to be dealt with. As it transpired, they'd landed on the southwest coast on the very day of the Battle of Barnet. Edward had done what he needed to do at Barnet, but only half the job was done. This moment of peace in the Wars of the Roses was to prove short-lived.